Fantastic. So as Amber mentioned, my name is Jimmy Guerrero, and the topic of my talk today, I'm going to try and make it a quick one here. I know this is it's been a long day, and I'm the last talk, so I don't know if I'm standing between you and the cocktails, but I don't want to be that person. So what I want to talk about today real quick is about an initiative that we started about a year ago at Ericto, and it was about bridging the Kaggle community and the Kubeflow communities together, and we did that by starting an initiative where we converted Kaggle competitions into Kubeflow pipelines, and in the process, sponsored Kubeflow community members to make open source contributions. So my name is Jimmy Guerrero. As I mentioned, I'm a Kubeflow community member. I'm currently the VP of Developer Relations at a computer vision startup, and I was formerly running developer relations at Ericto. I've been in and around open source for I don't know, maybe 20 some odd years before open source was cool at Red Hat, MySQL, and a bunch of other companies. So what was the big idea here? So the big idea was that let's curate some popular Kaggle competitions and make them work with Kubeflow. Why? The idea here is that we wanted to make it easy for folks to experience the awesomeness of Kubeflow by showing them how to develop pipelines step by step, using familiar Kaggle competitions, because by and large, people were really familiar with the Kaggle competitions, not so much with Kubeflow. So how could we use that as a launching point to get them exposed to some of the goodness of Kubeflow? And let's be honest, right? Kubeflow has a steep learning curve, so the more that we can reduce the angle of inclination there, the better. So you might be asking, especially if you're familiar with kind of the Kubeflow project, what's wrong with Kubeflow/examples? Well, when we started the initiative, and this is almost a year ago, when I took a look at it, we'll just call it what it was. A lot of the examples there were over 2 years old. They were untested against recent versions, and some of them even required some specialized components. The other one was that a lot of the examples were not relatable. A lot of the examples were based on overly simplistic kind of hello world examples. The use cases were incomplete. And I don't know about you, but when I come into a new open source project and I'm trying to get familiar with it, if the examples don't work, it's really frustrating, right? So these folks are not new to machine learning, but they are new to Kubeflow. So how can we level up the experience, basically roll out the red carpet to make it as easy as possible to get started with Kubeflow? So this is why we kind of centered on Kaggle. Now, there's a bunch of communities that we may have tried to kind of reach out to, but for me, Kaggle was a no-brainer. I mean, in 2021, they had over 8 million registered users. I mean, by now, I'm sure it's well north of that. We all know that Kaggle is the destination on the internet if you're doing data science or machine learning. If you want to find notebooks and data sets with a bunch of different examples, people trying competitions all kinds of different ways. And at the same time, if you're feeling competitive, compete for some prizes where there's real money involved. And at the same time, you can level up your machine learning skills in a collaborative and a community-oriented environment. So that has a lot of open source goodness built into it. The other thing I liked about the Kaggle community was that use cases, right? There's hundreds, maybe even thousands of competitions that oftentimes are funded by large corporations looking to solve very real business problems using machine learning. So it's a bit of a no-brainer that Google acquired Kaggle back in 2017. This totally makes sense, right? You've got a big audience, a super hyper-targeted audience that you can expose to your products and your services. So I thought, hey, look, I don't have anything to sell you, but I definitely have a technology I want you to get excited about in the form of Kubeflow. So let's just go ahead and take that approach. Now, one of the things that we had to figure out is, okay, how at some scale or velocity are we going to be able to get these competitions converted, right? So I wanted to reach out into the community, find people that were familiar with Kubeflow, but were also Kaggle competitors so that they could share their knowledge with other people, kind of be the ambassadors, so to speak. So Ericto fortunately stepped up in sponsoring these contributions to the Kubeflow project, which, it's good business. It's good for their business because the more people that use Kubeflow in production, the better for them. It's good for the contributors because they get the open source contribution, plus they can make a little bit of money at the same time. And it's also good for the community, right? Everything is given back as open source. So everybody benefits from that knowledge. And one of the reasons why we didn't want to resort to just the goodwill of people was because you may remember about a year ago, and this kind of happens in a cyclical fashion, is that there was a bunch of buzz about open source developers really getting frustrated with corporations and other companies making use of open source, but not giving back to the community, whether it be supporting the individual developers, the communities, the user conferences, the infrastructure that's required to drive these projects, et cetera. So we didn't want to be part of the problem. We wanted to be part of the solution. So we felt that this was kind of a win-win for everybody. Now, that's the plan. How do we kind of roll this out into execution? So the first thing we need to do is to go recruit some contributors. So we worked on getting the word out, and this is probably the last part of January, early part of February. We did a blog post, we posted the mailing list, we made announcements on Slack in a variety of different meetups and on social media. And in the end, pretty quick, we were able to vet out 4 contributors that demonstrated they have the necessary skills to write all the machine learning code and the documentation. And this was important because it wasn't enough just to kind of create the .py files or the YAML files. We actually needed to create instructions because, again, these are going to be Kaggle competitors who are going to be brand new to Kubeflow, and you have to walk them through the entire process. So we were able to get 4 contributors on the quick, which was awesome. So what were the deliverables that were in scope? 3 big things. The first one is going to be notebooks. So every competition that we translated into a Kubeflow pipeline, we wanted to have a generic, non-Kubeflow specific notebook, right? There's nothing special about it. It's just a notebook that that would be totally valid if you were just taking a competition, generating a notebook out of it, and it didn't necessarily have anything to do with Kubeflow. We wanted to use that as our base. The next thing we want to do is create a second notebook, which was tailor-made so that it would be easy to convert into a pipeline using the KFP SDK. And here we gave people the option of, you can either use Docker images or you can use Python, the functions, the lightweight components to build the pipeline, whatever made sense, right, for that particular competition. And then a third notebook, which was oftentimes just the original notebook with maybe a change or 2 that you could convert quickly into a Kubeflow pipeline using the open source Kale Jupyter Lab extension. So those were the 3 deliverables on the notebook side. On the pipeline side, we needed the correct YAML files, Python data files. If you could get them from the competition, sometimes you have to go out to Kaggle at runtime to pull those files, but all that code needed to be in the project. And as I mentioned, we gave contributors the option of either building the pipelines using Docker images and Docker Hub as a registry, or using Python functions, lightweight components. And of course, critical was the README and the blog post. It had to be really self-explanatory, really easy to follow, so that a Kaggle competitor who was new to Kubeflow could just follow it step by step, and bam, be able to have a pipeline and kind of realize the magic of it. So how did we choose what Kaggle competitions to convert? There's obviously way too many to choose from. So we kind of had 4 ways that we approached this problem, because we can't convert them all, as they say. So first of all, we collaborated with the contributors to find the competitions that were interesting to them. Of course, if you're not excited about a project, it's going to be a slog to get it all done. So that was kind of the primary concern: is, does this competition interest you? Is it something that you've thought about but never had the opportunity? Well, here is the opportunity. The other one is that I wanted to make sure that we had a mix of competitions that are in the getting started category, because this is people that are new, maybe even to Kaggle. We wanted to make sure that we get them early, get them exposed to Kubeflow early, but also, even if you're an experienced Kaggle competitor, you're going to be super familiar with the get started competitions, because those are the first ones that you touched. So it was really easy, right, to pick a few of those. But I also wanted to make sure that we picked some of the hot ones, the ones that were trending, the ones that were at the top of the list, had big prizes, because those would get people's attention. We also wanted to think about competitions that highlighted interesting business use cases or industry verticals. and that showcased a variety of machine learning disciplines like natural language processing, computer vision, etc. We wanted to have a good mix so there was something for everyone, regardless of what your skill level or familiarity was. Okay, so now we settle in on what the competitions are that we want to convert. How do we actually manage that process? So on the development side, the contributors worked independently in their own GitHub repos. The average dev time to go from, yeah, I'll take on that project to actually having a PR ready for submission was about 2 to 3 weeks. Now you want to remember that these are folks that, you know, are working after hours and on the weekends. So that told us immediately that, you know, it's not an insurmountable problem here, is that if you get familiar with Kubeflow, you can actually make this stuff happen pretty quick. Unfortunately, kind of one of the lessons learned here was that getting the PRs accepted by the Kubeflow project actually took 6 to 8 weeks sometimes. So that was really kind of our bottleneck. So we knew that that was a point of optimization at the conclusion of this initiative. So now we have a much better process for how do we get PRs into the project quickly once they're submitted. So a kudo goes out to an ex-colleague of mine, Chase Christensen, who worked with me and the contributors on Kubeflow community Slack, going back and forth, figuring out, you know, QA, what notebooks to work on, resolving issues with the pipelines, making sure that the documentation was all sorted out. So it was a collaborative effort that we did over on Kubeflow community Slack. So to date, we have completed 13 projects that you can find inside of the Kubeflow/examples directory. All of this stuff was contributed back as open source. I won't talk about all of these, but there's some interesting ones here. For example, the H&M personalized fashion recommendations competition. That one's kind of cool because it can utilize computer vision, but also NLP, all kinds of good stuff. The idea here is, how can you get an offer in front of a customer that you know is going to resonate with them and is going to provoke a purchase based on their previous purchases, browsing history, all that good stuff. So that was kind of an interesting kind of real world use case. The other one that's interesting is the American Express default prediction here. So this is a data set where the goal is, can you figure out of the customers based on a bunch of features and data points that you get, can you figure out or predict which of these customers are going to default on their cards? So then you can kind of think about what sort of mediation you want to do so they don't default on those cards. And then, you know, we had things like mobile subscriber churn, obviously your classic, you know, stock ticker predictions, some cryptocurrency stuff, as well as real estate, and then one that was a grocery store price forecasting. And then I'll round it out here. We had some getting started examples here. I think people are going to be familiar with the Titanic one. And then we had one that was based on Twitter data that was an NLP project. So a lot of good stuff, right, that we were able to accomplish in, I think, between kind of February and the September timeframe. Not too bad as far as the number of projects that we were able to deliver. So once the PR was accepted, we were ready to actually now start sharing the knowledge. So as I mentioned, all of this work, all the code, the data, everything can be found in Kubeflow/examples. And I think if you look at the titles of the different directories that are in there, if you just search for Kaggle, you'll find all of them. The other one is that we wanted to make sure that if people didn't know that those examples were there, that we basically brought the examples to the people. And we did that primarily through workshops. So every week, Ericto offers a free workshop that highlights one of the projects. And we actually haven't gone through all of them yet. So there's some new ones still that are going to be delivered in the next month. But every week you can catch one of these workshops from beginning to end that shows you how to take these competitions and build the pipelines to 2 different ways. And in that process, we also shot a bunch of how-to videos. So if you can't make the workshop, you can at least, read the README and the docs and look at the how-to video and see how these pipelines are built step by step, either using Docker images or the Python functions, or even the open source Kale Jupyter Lab extension. So yes. So here, I guess it's demo time. So let's see one of these competitions actually get converted into a Kubeflow pipeline and kind of have it all come, kind of manifest. So the example I'm going to use today was one that was probably popular, obviously, maybe a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, which was Kaggle's OpenVaccine competition that was primarily sponsored by Stanford University. And the idea here was to leverage data science to develop models and design rules for RNA degradation, and it had some data sets from a couple of other co-sponsors. So in this pipeline that we're going to build, we're going to use the KFP SDK, and we're going to use Docker images to build our components. We're going to use Docker Hub as our registry. And we're also going to have to pull the data directly from Kaggle using the Kaggle API. So the steps to build this pipeline is, first, we're going to prepare the remote Kubeflow environment. And for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to use Aricto's Kubeflow as a service. Then we're going to set up Docker Hub and Docker Hub, obviously remotely, Docker locally. We're then going to set up our Kaggle authentication. We're going to prepare a local development environment on the laptop. We're going to build some Docker images. We're going to push the images to Docker Hub, so that's going to act as our registry. We're then going to generate a pipeline YAML file. We'll then create an experiment, create a pipeline, and then we'll run and execute the pipeline, and we'll try to get it all done here in less than 5 minutes. Fortunately, it's a pre-recorded demo, because otherwise this would take a lot longer than 5 minutes. So let's go ahead and play this.
Right, in this short demo, we're going to show you how to convert Kaggle's OpenVaccine competition into a Kubeflow pipeline using the KFP SDK. All right, the first thing to do is, assuming that you've already got Kubeflow deployed via Kubeflow as a service, is to create a new notebook. So let's go ahead and name our notebook. Let's bump up our resources to 2 CPUs as well as 2 gigs of RAM. We're also going to want to bump up the allocation for our workspace volume from 5 to 10 gigs. Take the rest of the defaults and click the launch button. Once our notebook is up and running, let's go ahead and connect to it. And this is going to bring up Jupyter Lab. And with the Jupyter Lab UI up, we're going to want to open up a terminal session. And from here, we're going to want to git clone the Kubeflow/examples repository. And we'll see that populate in the left-hand side in our file browser. Now we're going to want to do a little bit of setup, which means that we want to go over to Docker Hub and create an account if we don't already have one. We're also going to want to install Docker locally. And once Docker is installed locally, we're going to want to then log into Docker. And we're going to be using Docker Hub as a registry for our images. Next thing we want to do is head on over to kaggle.com and create a API token if we haven't already done so. And we're going to use our Kaggle username and API token to create a Kubernetes secret, which is going to allow us to not have to pass those credentials in plain text when we run a pipeline. So let's navigate into the examples directory, OpenVaccine, and then let's create a file called resource.yaml and include in it the contents that you'll find inside of the README. And this is going to allow us to create a pod default, which again is going to mean that we don't have to pass our Kaggle credentials in plain text when we run a pipeline. Next up, let's move to our local machine. And here, let's verify that we've got Git. And then let's go ahead and clone the Kubeflow/examples repository locally into our development environment. From there, let's go into the directory. Let's go to pipeline components. Let's open up the load data directory. And here, this is the PY file that we're going to use to create our load data pipeline component. So let's go ahead and build a Docker image for load data. And once that image is built, we're ready to go ahead and push that image to our registry up on Docker Hub. And we can verify that it's up there by going to Docker Hub and refreshing the repositories view. And you can see that our load data Docker image is there. Next up, let's go to the preprocessed data directory, open up the preprocess.py file. And this is going to serve as the basis for our preprocessed data pipeline component. So let's go ahead and build a Docker image. And once the image is built, we're ready to now push it up to Docker Hub. Once we get the confirmation, we can verify it by going to Docker Hub, refreshing the repositories view, and we can now see that the preprocessed data component, or image I should say, is there. Next up, let's build our model training component. So you can see in the model.py file, this is going to serve as the basis for our pipeline component. So let's go ahead and build the model training Docker image. And once the image is built, let's go ahead and push that image up to Docker Hub. Once it's successfully pushed there, we should be able to simply refresh the repositories view and verify that we now see our model training image. Let's build our last component, which is going to be the model evaluation pipeline component. This is going to be the basis for that particular component. Let's go ahead and build a Docker image off that configuration, and then let's go ahead and push that Docker image up to Docker Hub. And this should be our final component that we should see up there on Docker Hub. By refreshing, you should be able to see the model evaluation component. Okay, up next, we're back on Kubeflow as a service. You want to open up the PY file that you've got here in your directory and substitute in the username as well as the image names and the tags that you used when you uploaded your images to Docker Hub. Now let's create a YAML file or a pipeline configuration file from that .py file. And once we have that YAML file, we're going to want to download it locally into our development environment. And now that we're in our local environment here, we're ready to actually build a pipeline. So let's go ahead and go to the Kubeflow UI. Let's create a new experiment for our OpenVaccine pipeline. So now we've got our experiment built. Now let's build a pipeline. So click on Upload Pipeline, name your pipeline, and now let's upload that .yaml file that we had just downloaded locally into our development environment. So select it and then upload it. And now we can go ahead and create that pipeline. So now we've got an experiment and we've got a pipeline. Let's create a run. Click on the Create Run button and make sure that we assign this run to the experiment that we just created a few seconds ago. Let's fill in our runtime parameters and click Start. Now we should be able to click on the details of this particular run, and we're taken to the runtime execution graph. You can see we've created a volume, we've loaded data, pre-processed the data, done model training, and wrap things up with a model evaluation. You can also get details about what's happening in each step by simply clicking on a step. You can get information about inputs and outputs, visualizations, details, log information, events, as well as ML metadata or artifacts. And that's it. You have successfully turned Kaggle's OpenVaccine competition into a Kubeflow pipeline using the KFP SDK.
All right, so that's that. So we'll wrap it up with some next steps. We're not done yet. So we're now looking at curating the next batch of Kaggle competitions for the coming year. So if this sort of an initiative or project sounds interesting to you, you can DM me over on Kubeflow community Slack, and we can work through the details on how to participate. And that is it. Thanks to Aricto for sponsoring the project, and thanks to Chase for helping QA the projects. And then finally, especially thanks to the contributors who helped create the competition conversions, but then also helped push that as open source, as contributions to the project. And that's it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jimmy. Any questions for Jimmy? Yo, we got a question in the room?
How did you, so it sounds obvious this is like a good thing to do, but I'm wondering how you measured the success of it, and if it has shown to be successful so far. Like, have you seen people, more people coming to Kubeflow since you've updated the examples?
Yeah, so I think the most obvious point of reference that I have is the number of people that show up every single week to the workshops. So we can get anywhere from 100 to maybe 20 people to show up every single workshop. It really kind of depends on the use case and kind of the competition, whether or not it resonates with folks. But we've been running these workshops, I want to say, since probably the springtime, and it hasn't let up since. So at least I know from my vantage point that people are finding these examples, are finding the workshops, and are interested in actually seeing someone put it all together so then they can put it together on their own.
And one of the things that I can also comment on is that we are looking at, we as in the examples, the folks that run the examples repo, looking at tagging that so it's versioned. So each of the examples are versioned, so you know which example works with what version of Kubeflow, because it's a little tricky, as Jimmy said. Some of them were outdated, they're not tested against newer versions. And so we're looking at a way to reversion the repo, if you will, with the examples being tagged and updating the examples, like in 1.7, the ones that we point to will be tested against 1.7, not just thrown out there. So that's another example of how these competitions and the new examples are driving the project to update how we do things on the project side. I wasn't sure if you were aware of that or not, Jimmy.
Sounds good.